Yeah, now it's working.
Okay. So I was thinking, if a website like Kialo or Socrates or any structured argumentation system based on URLs is based on URLs, there's a few observations. One is any premise or any claim could be represented by a URL. And in fact, one of the things we talked about, I think, we talked about even ambiguous statements have a lot of implied premises. And part of our goal is to take the implied premises and make them explicit, but you often start out with an essay or a URL linking to a news article, and there's just tons of implied premises in that article. So one thought is any URL could be thought of as representing a conjunction of premises. It's saying a bunch, this is true and this is true and this is true and this is true. We don't know exactly what that conjunction is. It's just a blob, that you can't break apart. But if you disagree with a premise that is actually a conjunction of premises, that implies that you disagree with one of the sub-premises or more than one, even though you haven't been able to specify which. And so you can just disagree with the URL basically. And then why do you disagree? I think what you might do is then say, well, I disagree with this URL, this news article, because I think this claim is false. And so your opposing argument is not B, where B is the election was a fraud, right? And whatever claim that you think was implied, you just claim the opposite, and that's why you disagree with that URL. And then someone might argue relevance by saying, well, that's not relevant. They might say, no, that is true, or they might say this article isn't saying that is true. This article never said, claimed that the election was a fraud or whatever. And by more explicitly restating the premise, what you think is the implied premise, and then saying, I disagree, I don't think that be, you start in that process towards progressive formalization.
Is it okay if I?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I really like the intuition of having an article or document or link as a conjunction of claims. Like that's might be a helpful interpretation. And then if you disagree with one of the claims, then because of the conjunction, you disagree with the whole thing. And then you can look deeper. One.
We had the idea that we'd have compound claims, and compound often will be conjunction, but it could be disjunction in some cases. And one reason we realize we absolutely need compound claims is because of progressive formalization. That is, somebody may express a compound claim as a statement, a text statement, and then somebody else has to come up and decompose it and say, well, actually, this is the conjunction of this claim and that claim. And those are meant to be equivalent. The notion of claim equivalence is very important. Saying, is this formalization, for example, really equivalent to the original linguistic form of the claim, or are multiple formalization equivalent, and so on. Now, ideally, we would like, there's kind of two conclusions we've reached. Agreeing on formalization is not that easy, so we really want to have a kind of plug and play of formalization mechanisms. On the other hand, if we want to have disambiguation, this will happen within the formalization. And it's entirely possible. I see a case where a sentence is decomposed using two formalizations, and somebody asserts, and by the way, those are equivalent to one another. Well, I suppose equivalence would be transitive. And it means different formalizations would be useful for different equivalences. Like, for example, if somebody codes up the Morgan's law, that becomes an equivalence, and you can say that, well, this other statement's also equivalent, because in this formalization, we see that non-trivial equivalence. And the Morgan is nearly trivial, but I'm assuming it isn't, because a lot of people don't know how to use it. If you have, what's really important is if you have a URL per claim, which I think makes sense, or identifiers, the reality is you'll have many identifiers. Because many people may do this claim mapping exercise we do, and we have to say, well, this is something Tim and I disagree on. By the way, I'm looking at a federated system. So we can do equivalence between this server has this claim under this URL, and that other server has this claim under that different URL. We can use distributed web hashes instead of URLs, and or again, probably, why not both type of thing. And again, if you're thinking as equivalence classes, it doesn't matter, right? We can have as many schemes as we want. But where I do agree is that when you disagree with something, you can say, I disagree because, and if the claim has been formalized and decomposed, it's easier to just say, well, I'm actually disagreeing with this component. And the disagreement carries over to the conjunction trivially. Whereas if it's not being formalized and all you have is text with a conjunction, then maybe you'll want to do the decomposition yourself before disagreeing, or not. You can just disagree. Let someone else do the decomposition. The last thing I want to say about all this is I want it to be very clear. I want us to be very clear about making the distinction between disagreeing with the premise of an argument and the argument itself. Like we can say, A implies B, well, A is false, or A implies B, no, A doesn't really imply B. And that's why for us, and that's something we agreed on very early on, the argument, the link between a set of premise and a conclusion is itself a claim, and is itself as agreed.
I think maybe, Marc-Antoine, sorry to interrupt, but maybe the terminology isn't quite settled there. I think the idea I totally understand. You call that link the argument. In Socrates, there is there's a separate premise in the form of B supports A or B opposes A. I think in the white paper, we called that the relevance. I say we, not we, but
correct.
So so the relevance is a premise. The premise is that B is relevant.
I'm calling it a claim, but yeah.
You're calling that the argument, right? The relevant claim is an argument, but maybe something that might help with terminology, taking one step back, every argument involves 3 claims. The claim, conclusion, you could call it the conclusion. Well, every argument always involves at least 3 claims. There's by the definition we've come up with, there's what you're trying to support. There is the premise, which
at least one premise, okay, fair, and the argument itself,
right, and the relevance claim. So there's always 3 claims. Now, if you have a URL based system, actually, sorry, I just wanted to clarify terminology. So I don't know whether we should call that 3rd claim the argument. That's what you're calling it, Marc-Antoine.
In our modeling, we call it support, the support, but it can also be an oppose. And we're still working on that terminology. Argument, I admit, is more my personal, but we all agreed it's a claim. That is something we did agree on.
So another observation is that you might say the argument, so there's the premise, so 3 claims playing different roles. One is playing the role of conclusion. One is playing the role of what we're calling premise. Although the 3rd one is also a premise. It's often called the unexpressed premise in argumentation theory literature, or maybe it's the warrant. Well, I'm not sure that's exactly what the definition of warrant is.
No, I think warrant is distinct. Yeah.
There's a third claim that is also a premise, the unexpressed premise, the relevance. So nailing down that.
Yeah, I don't consider. Well, yeah, go on. I don't consider that as a premise, but I see what you're.
Yeah, maybe it shouldn't be.
But that's not important. That's not important.
But what we do have is those
Yeah.
second and third claims, what we're calling, what I think that we've agreed to call premise, right?
Yeah.
And then the third claim, which is, kind of an implied claim, but that pair of claims is also a conjunction. With every argument, you're always asserting both B, and you're asserting that B supports A.
Yep.
And if you attack the argument, you can just do an attack saying like with a Dung framework, where you say, I'm attacking something in that conjunction, without specifying whether it's B or the claim that A supports B. Or you could specifically attack B or support B. And I think attack is not the terminology we've decided on. We've decided on oppose, since that's a little less of a harsh word. So your argument can support or oppose that conjunction of two arguments, or it can specifically, if you're going to be more formal, specifically oppose or support the premise or that third claim, the relevance. And by the way, some terminology that I've also run across is that first time type, if it's an attack, is called an undermining attack. And when you attack the relevance, is called an undercutting attack.
Okay, nice.
And then if you support the relevance, Tolman called that backing. And if you support the claim, I'm not sure what that's called, but just there.
The interesting that you think of it as a conjunction. It's obviously correct on the face of it, and I'm reminded of a form of the modus ponens, where you have A and A implies B implies B, and that's what modus ponens is. And so here the conjunction is explicit in that formulation of the modus ponens. I thought of the argument as I'm very much using. Are you familiar with frames in AI? It was a model of symbolic AI developed by Minsky originally, where basically you have a kind of predicate with named slots. And those correspond to the notion of role. So for me, the argument, what you call the implicit claim, is a frame with two slots, which are the premise and the conclusion. And there may be multiple premises, of course, or a compound premise. But but that's just a modeling difference. It's isomorphic. I don't think that's important at all. Treating it as a conjunction is interesting, except we may have to do a bit more work with variable unification if we have predicates with variables in the different as components, but that's not a big deal. No, sounds right. Sounds right. I have it as a higher level object, and it's one reason I'm very keen on having what I call recursive hypergraphs. That is, in normal graph modeling, you have nodes and edges, but you cannot have an edge pointing to an edge. For me, the argument mapping does require a recursive hypergraph. That is, you point at an edge and say, this edge is wrong, or this role is wrong. So anyway, that's another conversation. Probably one we'll have tomorrow in more detail. But yeah. What is clear is we want, in any case. Oh, by the way, one thing before I go into what is clear. One thing I want to point out is not all claim structures are conjunctions, right? And especially if we get into causality, you can have things that are have multiple factors of varying strengths and even synergies between them. So if you think of, the resulting probability increase over the base probability as some complex polynomial function of the presence of the various contributing factors. I'm giving that as an extreme example. This is more simulation than logic. And it's probably out of scope in most formalization systems. But I do want to make the principle that not, on the one hand, everything is conjunction because, or what is it? Because of conjunctive normal, disjunctive normal form. So you have a disjunction of conjunctions, and the disjunction would be multiple arguments. On the other hand, that's not always the most elegant way to represent something. And if we're thinking about deduplicating and using formalism to find equivalence, elegance is a bit of a consideration, not an overriding one, but it exists.
So I wonder, Marc-Antoine, is if even when the underlying structure of your argument involves, say, a disjunction, whether at the very highest level, you're still not always dealing with conjunctions. And I was just thinking of an example. Let's say your argument is, either we go shopping or we're not having dinner. And I'm not shopping. I'm not going shopping, right? And so the conclusion is, so we're not having dinner, right? So the assertion of that disjunction is your premise, and then you might have another premise, which in combination with that disjunction, if you assume that, accept that disjunction, and you accept that other premise, and that other premise might be unstated, but if you accept that disjunction, so the disjunction might just be one of many premises, either explicitly stated or implied in your argument.
I'm not arguing that there's not usually a disjunction. Of course, there's usually a disjunction, but I'm saying there's the other logical connectors play a role too.
I mean, there's usually a conjunction, but the other ones play a role. Yeah. So as you progressively formalize, eventually you need to fully represent that knowledge. You need to be able to represent the disjunction explicitly.
Oh, I agree totally.
Totally. Yep. And so maybe at the high level, you kind of always start with that like top conjunction of the pair.
At some point, I was like, let's use disjunctive normal form and let each disjunction be a separate argument and each argument be a conjunction because we're using disjunctive normal form. As I said, I think there's cases where it's not the most elegant, but those can be done in another formalism, and this formalism works, right, as we know from the solvability of predicate logic. Of course, when you start putting first or second order logic, it becomes something else. But
are we modeling
logic?
The question I keep asking.
Yeah, it's and the answer is at a certain layer. Yes, if when we want to deduplicate, absolutely. And we agreed that it should be conditional, and maybe we can push it in a separate layer. That's good. And we want a plug and play for logic architecture, so we went through that. But modeling, I think, since we want deduplication, modeling logic is on the agenda.
So the base layer, the common data model, won't make any assumptions about a specific logical formalism, I guess.
That's what we are agreeing on through this long process of these endless meetings. Yes.
Right. Although since the base layer does at least include premise and relevance as separate claims.
Yes.
When talking about the base layer, I think we should still be permitted to talk about, use the and a logical operator. You're claiming in your argument, you're claiming this and this. And
I would tend to agree. I'm thinking we cannot Well, but it's because you're modeling modus ponens as a conjunction, which I wasn't. And I guess that's why I wasn't modeling it as a conjunction, because it was a way to postpone conjunctions.
Jonathan, when you say that there's a need for and in a base layer, what is that? Like, why do you want to express and in
I'm not
your understanding of a base layer?
a need for and in the base layer. I'm just saying that when we talk about the base layer, and we talk about, okay, we got premise B and we got the premise or the claim, premise claim B, and the relevance claim that B supports A, we can see an argument as an assertion of both of those things. When talking about it, we can say, okay, what you're kind of doing when you make an argument is making two claims or making the conjunction of claims. And that's just sort of a mental model. And I don't think we actually need
so I agree with that, but I mean, my current stance on the base layer is that is the only argument that should be supported on the base layer. When argument is a highly overloaded term, right? For me, on a base layer, that is an argument. It's nothing more than a premise and relevance.
Yep. Yeah, I think that. Yeah, I think I agree.
Yeah, basically, so far we've special cased that structure as something that, as you point out, has an implicit conjunction, but we're not making it use the conjunction.
And it may seem, why I'm bringing up that that's an implicit conjunction, for me, it kind of helps clarify my thinking. But then kind of the next step I wanted to go on is, like, if you have something like Chialo doesn't break apart premise and relevance, right?
That's one of the missing features. Yeah, that's why I started this.
Yes, that's why we want to do something different. Absolutely.
What I was realizing is, what if, so Chialo, if it, it publishes a URL for an argument, and that URL, and that argument is made in a context, right? And so if it were to include metadata, like a microformat, kind of formalizing the structure, it would say, okay, I am an argument. And it would then want to specify its premise, which would probably be another URL. I mean, not its premise, it's the claim, the conclusion, which would probably be another URL. And that URL could just be a URL out on the internet, or it could be another Chialo formalized claim. And then it would, in the case of Chialo, the page where the argument is submitted, you would contain the argument itself. I think theoretically, instead of actually containing the argument text.
There's one. So no, I don't agree that that's what the page that contains the argument represents in Chialo, and that's also one of the main problems. The main problem I have with modeling arguments in a base layer past anything more than a premise and relevance is that page you're talking about of Chialo represents many arguments. It represents, I think a better way of describing it at some point is that what I'm actually doing is not argument mapping, but like information linking. It lists all the relevant information and whether or not it contributes like towards believing in that conclusion or not.
It doesn't give you a separate URL for each one.
Sorry?
It doesn't give you a separate URL for each piece of information.
Maybe now they do. They didn't have separate linking before.
Okay.
But I haven't checked in ages. So, but if you link to a Chialo argument, you link to a conclusion, and it just shows the underlying tree, and that can be a combination of many arguments. And that is what I call a base layer. It's the aggregation of all the different pieces of information that are relevant to make up your mind towards that conclusion. And that's why I say my base layer is about centralizing disagreement. It's more about showing what is all the relevant information, where do people agree, where do they disagree, to then having more meaningful discussion, which is something we agree on. My problem is when you say, when you jump really into the deep end of modeling arguments, there can even be disagreement on how the arguments are modeled. So what you're going to have is an overview that shows many different arguments. They might contain some of the same premises, reuse them in different fashions, and then you just list all of them, which for me is very much the equivalent of what we have now. You have many web pages, they reuse a lot of the same premises, and they just make their case. So then you have a long list of all the relevant arguments in terms of a conclusion. It doesn't really help with my purpose, my use case for the base layer, which is centralizing disagreements. I instantly want to aggregate the relevant pieces of all these different URLs in one place and have the claims where people are most likely to disagree to then resolve those, or not, or just highlight that people disagree.
Yeah, what Stephen calls the base layer, it's about saying the formalization wouldn't go further than identifying the group, the component of a claim. And so possibly the entity definition, predicate definition, or not, but mostly the premise, the various premise for each claim. And those are component, not a way, but
it's about finding all the relevant premises.
Yeah.
Whether it's for the claim or the negation of the claim. That's what it's about.
And we agreed that is an important use case, and
but that's also what Kialo does, by the way. The way I see it, that's what Kialo does. That's why I mentioned it. Kialo doesn't show one argument. Kialo shows an overview of many arguments.
Yeah. And Stephen and I have these arguments because these conversations, no, he did win me over that this was a proper separate layer. But for me, that's absolutely not sufficient. I do want the different versions. But I do totally agree that a page as he describes with centralized components without going into the argument structure is absolutely useful and relevant. That he did win me over that.
Whether a formalized argument is also absolutely essential, but that's for me the equivalent of
for a different use case.
Yeah, well, they might be linked somehow. Yeah. I'm not, but it's more like for me, like one full argument fledged out. That's one URL. That's like one blog post, one person that says in a fully formalized fashion, this is my argument why I believe in that conclusion.
The fact is, most of those tools that display, they display they never display an argument or a claim alone. They display it always with surrounding claims and structures around it and components and this and that. So it's not that we have the URL of a claim. We have the URL of a local neighborhood of a claim, which can be made equivalent very easily. I mean, if you're doing classical JSON LD, you can have the whole argument structure in a JSON LD structure, and then each component has an identifier, and you can use the fragment identifier to point to a specific argument from the URL. But then it's not unique because it may be in many views. But still, it's possible to use this as a component to pinpoint a specific argument in a specific web page, even if the web page has more than one thing. What is important, I believe, is RDF taught us resources have more than one locator, like more than one URI, URL. You can give a URN, you can do all kinds of things, UUID, it doesn't matter. You can give multiple identities to a claim, to a statement, and you expect multiple identities because someone else will have done the mapping in Kialo and someone else will have done the mapping in debate graph or in debate map. And I want to be able to say, hey, this is the same thing, and go look over there for more. Go jump from idea graph to Socrates. That's relevant to have the multiple views. So anyway, there's an equivalent system. Whether each claim has a page where it stands alone, for me, is perfectly uninteresting. Whether each claim has an identifier that's usable everywhere is extremely important. Whether the tools, the systems will display things alone versus curated neighborhood maps or uncurated neighborhood maps, I think this is where the action is anyway. It's not, but being able to pinpoint any component of the map is important. It's just maybe it will be at the fragment level rather than the URL level, and I'm perfectly fine with that because the fragment is part of the URL.
So if you can pinpoint either a claim with either URL or a URL plus fragment or a hash, if it's a distributed hash table like IPFS.
IPFS, yeah. IPLD.
So what I think some argument systems will have, including Kialo. So let's say Kialo has, the the full argument with all the supporting claims. Let's say you can get one of the supporting claims using a hash fragment or using some other form of the URL to identify that claim.
Yeah.
But an observation is that claim is also being used to support some conclusion. And so what that URL, is representing is actually that pair of claims.
Maybe not.
So
I would.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A claim could be used in several maps.
So that's true, except for if Kialo lets you use a URL to identify. So in Kialo, claims are always made in a context. I think that's.
Yeah, Kialo is not canonical.
Yeah, no, but I think it's interesting to explore for purposes of progressive formalization. So if Kialo maybe doesn't allow you to reuse claims because the claim is wedded to that context. It is made in the context of an argument, and therefore is not canonical.
So I would say that the Kialo URLs are argument IDs. They're not subclaim ID.
Exactly, right? And in that claim, that URL represents a claim that is not canonical, that is tied to that context. And it represents relevance. And Kialo doesn't separate the two concepts. And so if you wanted to identify, like if Socrates then wanted to somehow point to the relevance claim, it wouldn't have a unique URL to do so, because that URL represents the conjunction of B and A supports B. And so there's no unique identifier. So the URL.
It's very simple to add a fragment, a premise fragment or conclusion fragment.
Well, so
and even if Kialo doesn't understand that, it still allows other tools to talk about it.
That's what I was kind of trying to get to, like how this interlinking could work, and with progressive formalization, even if Kialo doesn't understand that, you could still, so you could do all sorts of interesting interlinking where you could argue, the discussion started on Kialo. Someone said B to support A, and then you can start arguing whether B supports really supports A in a different system. Another thing you could do is even Twitter. So first of all, a tweet can be.
But you'd have to include the entire context of Kialo at that point as well, right?
Right. The only way to understand, you'd have to make sure, so whenever you're talking about a claim from another site, those claims are always made in context.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so when linking, you'd have to create the UI in such a way that people understand, and I think that's possible, that you are arguing this claim that was made in that context, even though we're now in this context. And that sort of context shifting happens. I see that in social media all the time, where and explicitly stands out to me when somebody from one political party tweets something, and then somebody else, instead of responding to that tweet, what they do is take a screenshot of it, and then they retweet that screenshot to their followers, and then explain why they think that's bullshit, and what they've done is, well, first of all, often they'll explicitly, deliberately hide the context of that tweet in order to mislead their followers. But when, and that's a good indication of, a screenshot of the tweet is a good indication that people are perhaps trying to be dishonest, but it can also be done in a way where the context is clear, where you screenshot the tweet as a response to another tweet, and then you start, basically you're talking about that conversation, and especially if you link to it so people can go and see the context. I've seen that in Twitter, where people say, look, this person claims this, and here's my response. And the key is, what was that?
Twitter has a quote tweet also, which is not a reply, but it has the tweet in context. So
yeah, the reason people, the other reason people screenshot, sometimes it's to erase context, you're right, but sometimes it's also because they want to make sure that the tweet won't get deleted, and they want to keep saying he did say that. And linking differentiates those two usages.
And then, so there's all sorts of cases where I think a structured argumentation system could link to Twitter. Often people will post a URL and then comment on that URL. And that can be interpreted as this URL is a claim that supports this statement. So
contains a claim probably, but yes. Okay.
Okay, yeah.
So the way I plan to do stuff like that is really to have a claim with context, where the context is the URL basically to the external thing, but you would still always have to extract a claim out of that URL, and then it has an associated claim, which is this claim is expressed in that source, which can also be denied at that point.
Yep.
And it's something that I was planning to do at a later stage. That's only relevant if other people, if it's not the author of the web page that makes that claim, so to speak. So if as the examples I have on the homepage right now show, if it's the author of the web page that links directly to a claim, to a central layer, it doesn't matter. You don't need to, of course, it's the author of the web page that claims it. But if you start like annotating, or you have other people making that claim that somebody said in a different source, then you do need that. And then you have like at that point, what you can start adding them up, all the implicit claims entailed therein.
I think we've mostly agreed that there's this big distinction between the claim and context, and I call it what I call the decontextualized claim. Not everybody agrees with that terminology.
I like it. So.
Tim's notion of canonical debate is to work only with decontextualized claims. He's not that, and he wants to.
Well, it's a decontext. The reason it is so is because it is a decontextualized claims that make things canonical. Because a contextualized claim, by its very nature, is not canonical.
Exactly.
So that's why also a contextual claim, ideally, and that's what I just tried to explain, links to a decontextualized claim.
And vice versa. And vice versa. I totally agree. The idea is we need URLs for contextual claims, and we need different URLs for the decontextualized claims. And the other phenomenon, which I think is fundamental, is what I call the phenomenon of interpretation. Here's the claim as stated in this context. And here's a comparatively less contextual version, or an attempt at decontextualizing it by making some of the contextual assumptions explicit. And the notion being that a given claim in a given context may have multiple interpretations, which may or may not be equivalent.
And that's why I said you always have the source and the decontextualized claim as being a claim in itself, what you would call, I don't know what you would call it, but it's always useful to express it in claim form. If it's a claim, expressed in claim form. So I would say when the author of this source said decontextualized claim, no, sorry, the text, they meant decontextualized claim. Yep. That is a citation claim, or whatever you want to call it. And at that point, you can be redirected to the decontextualized claim, which is where you want to have the canonical debates, or you can disagree, that's not what they meant, and then you can start having counter arguments to that claim, which is also a claim. It's simply a claim that pulls in a decontextualized claim and some additional text which is quoted from the source and contains a link to the source.
Yeah.
Now, the one way people might do things is, rather than formalizing the claim that this article claimed X, where X is a decentralized claim, is just treat that article as a claim, and then respond with the argument not X, where X is a decentralized claim. And of course, now what you've implied, the implied premise is that this article said X.
There's a level of where that makes sense in UX. You don't want to force someone to formalize, extract the claims when they just want to disagree with an article. There's another sense that deeply bothers me. Article is not a claim. It's a document which contains claims and some explicit claims and some implicit claims. And saying this claim is in this document. Disagreeing with the document, what does it mean? You're disagreeing with a specific claim in the document. Maybe it's the main claim of the document. That's probably a claim too.
But would what we are talking about right now support in any way disagreeing with the document? Because I don't see that.
Yeah, basically what I'm saying is I did not see that as a use case.
Okay.
I can be
Great.
talked into, but I do see why it's a useful shortcut. So I can be talked into it, but certainly it has to be made very explicit when this is used as a shortcut. That is a shortcut for the operation of isolating a claim in a document and saying, this is what I'm disagreeing with. I think that's important because you never disagree with all the claims in a document.
No,
right?
that's the point. That's why we're
But if
talking
it's a
about this. So
conjunction,
why
do.
support something we are trying to fix is what I'm wondering.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't even consider the option in what we're building or talking about right now to disagree with a document. That's the problem.
What Jonathan said, like if you treat the document as a conjunction of its claims, then it makes sense. Then it's very fuzzy to disagree with a book, for example. But if you treat the book
like
as a conjunction of all its claims, then it's
But
logical.
that's I think where Marc-Antoine's formalized arguments come in. Like then you could say, like, once you have formalized arguments, a document can contain multiple arguments. It can have a set of conclusions, and then you can see whether or not you agree with that set of conclusions. And then a formalized argument starts making sense, because then you can start testing you as a personal reader facing the author that makes some arguments, whether or not you agree with that argument as well. But this is no longer an aggregation of arguments. Again, this is a separate use case.
No, what Jonathan is saying is it can be a pre-formal step to just say, I disagree with this document, to mean I disagree with at least
all
one
the
argument
conclusions
in
therein.
text.
Yeah,
Or,
okay.
At least one.
Or at least one, yes, true.
And so your argument, but that can be a first step towards formalization.
Yeah.
So there's this document from CNN and it makes all sorts of things, claims that, or implies claims you think is false. Or a spot on Fox News or whatever. But you start the formalization by first creating a canonical claim. You know, the the polar ice caps have increased in extent since 2012. You know, maybe Fox News claims that in part of their segment. You formalize that claim and you submit an argument where the conclusion that you're opposing is just the article, and the premise that you submit as support is the negation of that canonicalized claim. And so from a UI, there's an article, and then there's somebody saying it's not true that polar ice caps have been since 2012, the extent is increased. And
that's not a premise, though. That's just expressing belief or agreement. You had this lengthy talk about it yesterday. I prefer to call it agreement at that point, but whatever, it's that one individual saying, I don't believe in that claim, or I believe in the negation.
Well,
which is the same.
Always whenever you link in, someone submits an argument, that's a person submitting an argument and saying that this is a reason to believe or disbelieve that. And so the argument is, you know, the fact that X is false is a reason to disbelieve this conjunction of claims.
Oh, you mean the source, the entire article?
What was that?
So it's a reason to not believe the entire article.
And it's a reason to believe that not all the claims in that article are true. Or reason to believe that at least one in that
that's weak enough. I'm very comfortable with it, yes.
There's an interesting thing in Tailtear, by the way. I think I ran into that as well in the past. It also presumes that the author of that argument claims that claim to be true.
Exactly. And so that's what will happen is you say not X, something in this article is false. In other words, that article as a claim, as a conjunction of claims is false because X is false. And then someone else will say, because, and let's say X is because the moon, it's not true that the moon is made of green cheese, right? And then somebody else says, this is not relevant. The fact that the moon is not made of green cheese is totally irrelevant in this case. It does not oppose that conjunction of claims because nowhere in the article did the author claim or imply that the moon is made of season. What this does is it allows interpretation to be argued about.
Yes, that's important. I would tend to make it like if we have a shortcut to disagree with an article with that semantics, which I think is actually a very good idea, I would make it explicit. Like when you're doing that, you are making explicitly two claims, that the article asserts this claim and that here's the counter evidence for that claim. And so people could attack directly the presence of the argument in the article.
I mean, that's the opposite. That's what I want. I want them not to disagree with the article, but the question here is, what if you do want to?
No, but I'm saying there's a UX shortcut where you disagree with the article, and what it does structurally at the data level is saying, here's this claim is in this article, and here's a reason.
No, it's not which claim. How do you know which claim? You don't know which claim.
No. The person, I'm assuming that the person disagreeing with the article says this article is wrong because implicitly it claims X, because not X, and implicitly he's saying an X is in the article. But let's make that explicit. Let's put that in the data structure. X is in the article. X is claimed by the article, and
Okay, I do agree there. For me, that means there's two different ways of citing an article. One is citing a position in the article, and you just point literally to, by that position, let's say if it's in a video, it could be like a timestamp or whatever. If it's in a piece of text, it's a copy paste of the text or a page number or whatever. We can talk about the specifics there later. But the other way is just, sorry?
And Hypothesis has solved that for us mostly.
We'll see. And then the other one is indeed not saying that, like an unlinked whatever.
Yeah, in looking at the article as an opaque conjunction of claims without trying to break it down, at least initially. But what happened?
Would you want to support that though? I'm still wondering, because in what way is this useful?
So I guess I'm still coming from the angle of progressively structured argument into social platforms.
It's a case of progressive formalization.
And making it something that people are familiar with, and it looks like things people are familiar with, something that's quick to learn because people are familiar with it. But people with a little bit more, advanced users can start to formalize things. And then even when the advanced users start to formalize things, all the other users don't even necessarily notice a difference. And that's sort of my general thinking. It also allows us to recognize the implicit arguments in a lot of stuff that's out there on the internet. And even if something like Kialo, which has taken one step towards formalization relative to, say, Twitter, has not taken enough steps, what you can do is when referring to something in Twitter or referring to something in Kialo, you can add the additional information. And so.
But that's what I'm calling interpretation, but I agree. Yeah. Because you are, by pointing out the argument in the even micro document, like a tweet, you're kind of lifting it out of its context ever so slightly, and you're decontextualizing it ever so slightly. And that's already an act of interpretation, most likely.
You're kind of killing two birds with one stone. You are at the same time that you are interpreting that article. One tiny piece of that article, I'm interpreting this article to a claim, among other things, X. So you're moving towards interpretation and you're starting the argument in one simple move.
Yeah. And if it's a straw man, people can call you on that separately, which is fine.
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, in a way, it doesn't matter. For me, this is already, I would say, a layer 2 concern. The central point is that these things, but you're laughing about it, but it's true. The central point is that they are linked, and that's something we're all agreeing on right now, to a decentralized claim that gets added. And the reason I think it's a layer 2 concern is because there's different way of doing that linking. There's different ways of agreeing and curating on which
No,
Are you going to allow like this article says some total bullshit if there's no reason whatsoever to believe that is stated in that article?
okay, I think that a
separate.
lot of this does belong in what I think of as layer one, and let's analyze, because I'm trying to see which you see as layer two. Like saying this claim is identified with this document fragment. For me, I saw it as a layer one thing. It's about the provenance of a situated claim. Then you have claim identification.
But why does the provenance matter if the goal is to be canonical? Why can't you have 100 different systems that all link to a decentralized canonical claim? That's what we want. The thing that's essential is the decentralized claim.
Because I think that none of the claims make any sense without going back to context.
They do make sense, but they're decontextualized. That means that they might be ambiguous, which means that there might be claims where you add context. And this is the confusing bit. When we say that you add context to a decontextualized claim, it's still decontextualized. It's just more specific, right?
Yeah. What I'm saying is, I don't believe the bank of decontextualized claims to be intelligible without reference to their contextual vis-a-vis. I'm claiming that.
But the point is that it shouldn't be relevant. So you cannot discuss a decontextualized claim if you need to read what everyone that ever claims to have claimed that, like God is real. If you need to read and interpret everyone that has ever said that and links to that decontextualized claim, that discussion becomes.
I think you're jumping from some to every. I think you need at least some. You're saying you cannot have every, which I agree with. But I think you need to read at least some in context to fully understand the decontextualized claim.
The point is, if the decontextualized claim is ambiguous, which it will often be, then that discussion of that decontextualized claim will lead to more useful claims. That's the point.
No, there I agree with you. I'm not disagreeing with that, but I'm thinking that this discussion cannot exist without reference to contextual versions. So for me, the link to contextual, okay, listen, it can be in a separate ontology. I don't like to call it as a separate layer, but I don't want to argue that part. That beyond the point, we disagree on what's in layer one. We've always did. We always
I don't think
will.
it matters for this discussion.
It doesn't, exactly. Let's move on. But
are you saying you cannot discuss a decontextualized claim, God is real, without having any source that mentioned that?
I'm thinking that it's going to be an idle discussion. Yes, I think it's a discussion that will run in circles without going to the source sometimes. But that's not the point I want to get into. Let's get to another point.
It's a relevant point, because
it's a relevant point. It's a relevant point, but I'd like to move on to another point first. Point of order. It's not a point that this is not relevant. It's the point that I don't want to make that argument my main argument. I want to make the second argument and make that the subject of conversation. Thank you.
Go ahead, Marc-Antoine.
Sorry. It's like,
I don't know if I can help here, but I think maybe when you say context, what you mean is that a claim is always made, say, on a web page, at a certain time, and there are a bunch of assumptions. You can't talk to another person without a bunch of assumptions about what language you're speaking. So what we want is the canonical claim to be a claim that depends on as little context as possible. We don't want understanding that claim to require going back and looking at all the assumptions that the people assumed when they made that claim, right? If you're deep in a conversation in Kialo and you make a claim, you assume that everyone that is interpreting that claim is familiar with that whole conversation. There's a lot of assumptions, there's a lot of context. What we want to do is make that claim in a place where there's just very little context to start with. We just want to go to some website and say the canonical claims website, and that's the only context. And the context is you can think of it as common knowledge. It's what everyone interpreting that claim knows and assumes everyone else knows. And so there's very little assumed common knowledge if you just go to a canonical claims website and make a claim in as clear a language as you can. You just kind of assume that these are people, maybe you assume that they're Americans, or maybe you assume that it's just people on the internet during this time of history, right? And even then, there's a lot of assumptions, there's a lot of context, a lot of, I mean, the ability to communicate requires assumptions about the people you're communicating with. But that is what we're trying to do is start with a context with as few assumptions as possible. And I think sometimes, Marc-Antoine, you've used the term adding context, and then Stephen says, no, it's the opposite we want to do. And you're saying the same thing, right? By adding context, what you're trying to do is make these implicit assumptions that come from the context explicit. But in another sense, we want to remove context in that we don't want to have any of these assumptions in the first place. Now, we're still going to have assumptions, no matter how, what the context that the claim is posted in, just assumptions about people in general. And then you want to add clarification. You want to make those assumptions explicit. But maybe you shouldn't use the term adding context so much as decontextualizing, right?
Okay, so we're stuck on the first point. That's it. Because my headache is coming back.
I might have just made your head explode. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, sorry. No, and I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but it's true. You're pointing out one of the big difficulties we're having in this group is what is context. On the one hand, when I speak of decontextualized claim, I do mean as opposed to contextualized claim. What I mean in contextualized claim, I mean claims with provenance. Claims attached to this was found in this document, in this conversation, and this whatever.
And the provenance, by very little context, the provenance could be this claim was made as a top level claim on the canonical claims website.
The interpretation of the provenance is a human activity. Yeah. Now, it is true that what happens also with the contextual claim from a document is that you can say much more because of the document context. And again, this is not something I intend to model. This is just, I want to model the fact that this came from that's provenance.
Right, the provenance.
And there's a human interpretation of the whole document, right, and maybe the conversation in which this document lives, especially if it's a micro document. And the community of practice and the linguistic subcommunity and the belief system of the tribe making that statement. There's all this contextual information, not modeled, that allows you to identify implicit premises, unspoken definitions, all kinds and specific interpretations. And then there can be, as we said, argument about those interpretations. So and the question is, are those things, these implicit premises and so on, they're like when Tim spoke of context, he was thinking more of, can we have entity identification, for example? And if we have entity identification, we can point an entity, we spent a lot of time on the Paris is nice sentence. And do we mean Paris, France, Paris, Texas, Paris, Hilton, Paris, the Greek hero, and so on. So being able to point to a specific entity, for example, in Wikipedia, whatever, right? It also adds context. It's entity context. And we've spoken about using hashtags for that, which I'm dead against. But these are all, what I'm saying is there's all kinds of interpretation specifics we can bring in around a linguistic expression situated that we cannot do if we see it in isolation. I think that whether provenance is in or out of layer one, and that's not a conversation I should have brought out, sorry I did. The notion that the distinction between decontextualized and contextualized claim belongs in layer one, because the associating a claim with its more precise interpretation, you won't associate the same interpretations to the same sentence in different contexts. That means that the interpretation link is provenance dependent. Now, does it have to be provenance aware? Does the provenance need to be in the same layer? Who cares? But the interpretation will be different depending on provenance. Now, if you can factor it out to the decontextualized claim and say, well, here's the decontextualized claim, and here are all possible interpretations which come in from different provenances, which we may not want to discuss. But there's a point where you'll want to say, why do you think that this is an implicit premise? This is not an implicit premise of that usually. Well, it was in this context. I'm saying I don't see a meaningful conversation arguing about, is this a plausible interpretation of that decontextualized claim that won't at times need to go back to provenance. So A, we'll have to store provenance. Whether we store it in a separate layer is totally a different story.
I agree, but that's the exact discussion we're having.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is,
if you want to talk about interpretation, sure, of course you need to go to the source. You need to go to the specific article.
And I'm saying interpretation totally belongs in layer 1, in the base layer. You may isolate the provenance link if you want, but I don't see how you cannot have the interpretation in the base layer. And that's really what I wanted to bring.
So if you were to have provenance in the base layer, so if you were to do this, so every claim has a provenance. This is where the claim was made.
Yeah.
And then you say, okay, but wait a minute, a claim that's made deep in the discussion tree. So for example, let's say there's on the site, where people are discussing Greek mythology, and somewhere in there, someone says Paris is nice. And then as if you go to his travel forum, someone says Paris is nice, right? But then, so you can represent that claim, and these words said in this context, and the context points to the exact place where these things were said.
Yeah.
And that URL identifies the context and provides the information that a human needs to do the human activity of interpretation. But I think what Stephen is saying is having conversations about those statements made in very deep context has limited value. It would be better for somebody to go to the canonical claims site and say, Paris, the mythical figure from Homer, was not a nice person. And
I agree totally with that. And this is the point of that's what an interpretation is. It's taking this ambiguous statement and saying, in this context, here is a less context dependent, less indexical, more decontextualized. And this is why I'm saying decontextualization is it's not an absolute status. It's most of the time it's a relative status. We've made it more recontextual, more clear, less ambiguous. And somebody can say, oh, but you also forgot to decontextualize that, to specify that word, because that word's also ambiguous. So there'll be another version that's even more decontextualized, and it's a chain, and it's the endpoints of the chain that are interesting. But there'll probably be sentences that long.
This is an
which is fine.
This is an entire discussion about whether or not the interpretation as represented in a given source is a certain decentralized claim, correct?
Okay.
Everything you're saying now is like having arguments about whether or not a certain author in a specific source meant that decentralized, formalized, whatever claim.
No, there's kind of two questions. The question is a certain comparatively decontextualized statement a plausible interpretation of a certain statement? People will be arguing about that, and then they'll say, well, it can be an interpretation in this context.
In this context, meaning a source.
Yes.
So my point is that entire discussion, you cannot have it without, if I were to represent that in Socrates, for example, where I only have decentralized claims, the only way to do that would, in every claim, that discussion, a bit like Kialo does, refer to the same source. When I say this supports that claim in that source, you cannot have a meaningful decentralized discussion about that supporting premise to that conclusion in that source if you don't also pull in, this is about the discussion about whether or not the interpretation in that. You see my point? And that's why I see it as a layer 2. It's like I mean, I don't even care whether you store it in a base layer or not, but the point here is that's what we're trying to avoid. So I fully disagree that, yes, conceptually you can disagree with interpretations.
Okay, I see what you're saying, and in my view, what you're saying is, if you have a view that's based on decontextualized claims, and you're saying you'd need the provenance for each of those. No, because that's a decontextualized claim. It has not one but multiple instances with provenance. So what you would do is have like a side window, say where has this claim been used, and then you could go, if you want, to the source if the claim is unclear. But what I'm saying is, when arguing between,
no,
if you want.
No, because the point is that that claim, that decentralized claim, shouldn't, its definition, its interpretation should not rely, hence decontextualized, on any of the contexts that it claims to be.
And I'm saying that's an asymptotic ideal, and it will never be possible in practice, and you'll want to keep the provenance so people can understand a claim that you thought was clear, but they didn't.
Would you agree
They'll
with
need the context to clarify it. We're all doing our best to make our statements less context dependent, but we all continuously fail because we all continuously come with the context in our mind.
So that's fine. And that's indeed why within a system that supports decontextualized claims, you can also make decontextualized claims more and more specific by adding context, still with each claim being fully decontextualized. And that's how within a decontextualized claim system, in a base layer that I'm talking about, you can resolve that issue as well without referring to any external sources and interpretations and discussing whether or not interpretations were correct.
I'm saying that's possible in theory, but I expect it to fail in practice. That's all I have to say.
So your point is you can't, what is not possible?
To have, to not spin your wheels if you have erased the provenance and you cannot access the provenance anymore. At some point, there will be a point. What
do you mean by spin your wheels?
Meaning have an argument where people cannot agree on terms enough to even agree to disagree.
So you think you can't find disagreement on highly ambiguous claims like God is real?
I think that these highly ambiguous statements, if I want to argue about it, I want to go into definition of God.
Yeah, but we agreed there.
And the historical why was that, and let me respond to Saint Anselm's argument. Let me respond to Saint Thomas's argument, the various arguments, and I'll probably want to dismount the classic arguments one by one. And that means I'll go to the provenance.
Okay.
And I'll explain why is that such a historically accepted premise? Where did that come from? What's the meaning? What's the symbolic meaning of that in this society? And so on. Yeah, I would.
So I also don't disagree there, but the way I see that is as a decontextualized claim that says God as perpetrated by, and then St. Thomas, whatever, and that's the most specific decontextualized claim without even necessarily referring to a source.
Well, of course, it's possible. What I'm saying is it's an idealized end result, and I'm saying at any point as you're building the end result, you'll need to go back to the source, and it will be if you have erased the provenance from your database because it's not in the layer you care about, you will do a disservice to your users because there's a point as they build things that they'll need, oh, what did they mean by this? I don't get it. And they'll want to go back to the source to understand what they meant.
Yeah, but yeah, I agree and disagree. Yes, the source can be important. And yes, if you want to understand what they meant in one particular source, you can do that. But if you have 10 different sources that all do that, they will mean different things. And the whole point of the decontextualized claim is to resolve the disagreement in what is meant by...
No, there we agree. And yes, the process should be to move towards a version where the 10 different provenance, if they mean something different, we'll identify how they differ. We'll identify the decontextualized claims, the relatively decontextualized claims, and say, well, this one is actually distinct from this one because here there was this assumption, here there was that assumption. And so we can use distinctions, even decontextualized distinctions, to establish how that sentence, which is probably ambiguous because it was taken directly from the source, is not that useful after all. And we need to look at, okay, which version do you mean? Which decontextualized version do you mean? And for me, one reason of doing the formalization is precisely so we can identify the components, because most of the time, the distinction will be entity distinction that is easier to resolve than the claim nature distinction. Analyzing makes distinctions easier. That's a claim, of course. And so I want the layer one to have the notion of components, even if we don't specify how the components are put together. So that we can establish distinctions at either the claim or at the component level. But yeah, I mean, I'm not, we're not that far.
I agree with the use case. The only thing that I'm saying is that once you have a decentralized claim in, it doesn't matter where. Once
we want to make it as autonomous as possible.
Yeah, you shouldn't, in order to interpret or argue about it, you shouldn't have to go to the sources where it has been interpreted.
I agree totally with that as a goal. I'm just saying it's never going to be absolutely achieved. And whenever it fails, we'll need access to the provenance to improve it further.
What do you mean?
It's an asymptotic goal.
What is not achieved?
The fact that every sentence in the system is clearly intelligible without ambiguity.
It isn't. That's not the goal. It's not the goal for each sentence, each claim to be intelligible.
Each decontextualized claim to be intelligible without access to provenance.
That's not the purpose. A lot of disagreement is about claims that might to some people be intelligible and to others not, or that have different interpretations, etc., in different contexts. A lot of source of disagreement stems from that fact. What I want in a base layer is model that disagreement. The goal of the base layer is you start with that maybe intelligible or not intelligible claim. If it's intelligible, there will be maybe a lot of agreement or not.
No, we share that. We share that. I mean, ultimately, what we want to say is, here's the original statement, and I can decontextualize it in the sense that here's the same sentence in 10 different documents. But guess what? This is an ambiguous claim as such.
That's a perfect outcome. If you have
yes, I agree. And that means here is its interpretation as less ambiguous claims, or that each different interpretation in different documents. And we may or may not want to keep the documents. I argue we would. What I'm saying is, this is what we want. Yes, we want people to be able to work only at the decontextualized layer. Yes. And that when they enter through an ambiguous claim, they're basically redirected. Here are the 10 less ambiguous versions. Which one do you mean?
But is less ambiguous for you a contextualized one?
Less ambiguous is a decontextualized one. The idea is the contextual claim is not ambiguous in context, or maybe it is, may or may not be ambiguous in context. But when we interpret it, we're rephrasing it as a less context-dependent phrasing. And that's what I mean.
I would say decontextualized, otherwise the purpose is lost.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. And hence a more a less ambiguous phrasing. And so when you re-enter the system using that sentence, the original ambiguous one, you'll be redirected. Here are 5 comparatively less ambiguous statements that have all been shown to be interpretations in different contexts, even if there we don't have to show the contexts. But here are, and which one are you interested in? And let's look at the local argument map around that. But what I'm saying is, at some point, you'll look at those 5 And one of them, you're like, this is still unclear to me. What does that mean? So I can make that one less ambiguous and maybe divide it, fork it, because there's still ambiguity there. And this is where you'll want to go back to the context to see, well, actually here you thought it was.
But what if there's two contexts?
But if there's many contexts, then the point is, this is where you're able to draw a distinction to say, look, in this context, this meant this, and in that context, this meant that, and I can use those contexts to introduce a new distinction, and I will reformulate the original decontextualized claim into more decontextualized claim, because as I said, it's a relative measure, not an absolute status, and by exposing a further ambiguity that was not caught in the first pass.
I think some concrete examples might help.
Yes. Yes.
We're way over time, which
yes.
we can certainly waive an unlimited ending if we want, but
and I still have a headache.
yeah.
Can't believe I said
Marc-Antoine is sacrificing his brain for this project.
So is it true that Stephen is saying he envisions a system where all claims are made in the same context, which is defining context here as being the place on the internet where that claim is made. And it's not somewhere deep in a conversation in Kialo. It's always at the top level of Socrates or whatever the website.
The point of the canonical debate is to have this, we have a claim and we want to say, okay, go to the canonical debate, translate that.
So is
look
that
at the neighborhood of that claim? Yeah.
Provenance, and would you say that we always want the provenance of the claim in the canonical system to be the same? The provenance is always the canonicaldebate.com. This claim was made in that context. Now you can make this talk about what Hegel said about God. You can talk about and argue about Hegel's interpretation of the dualism of God and whether that implies this or that. But that conversation about another conversation might always happen in with the same exact provenance. That is, always happen in the top level of canonicaldebate.com or whatever.
I like how you're putting it, and I would go even further. When a claim is introduced in the canonical debate as a decontextualized claim, its context is the whole state of the system at the moment that claim was made.
So no, that's why I wholeheartedly disagree, because the whole point is that the only context required to interpret the claim, it doesn't matter that it's represented on canonical debate or Socrates. Right now on Socrates, it's only the text, it's only the claim text. And that is the context. The only context needed to interpret that claim is the formalized form of that claim, which right now in most systems is nothing more than a piece of text. And we can progressively formalize that more and more, and we can agree on whether or not it should contain entities and posits and all that stuff. I'm fine with that. My point is that the whole premise of being able to make this canonical is that is the only context you need in order to interpret the claim. Yep. Once you start linking to external sources, that's where you get into trouble.
But that's the same as saying the provenance is Socrates.com, the context of Socrates.com, and that is as close as you can get as having no context, right? Just the pure text without any other context laden with assumptions that leads to a certain interpretation. I think Marc-Antoine is saying you always have assumptions, you always have context.
So you said you want to model the assumption that there is no context, is what you're arguing now, right?
Say that again.
You want to model, like if you say it's a claim that's on Socrates, then you want to model, well, because it's on Socrates, it doesn't have any additional context or something like that.
Something like that. In fact, what you could do is say, here's the provenance of that claim, Socrates.com, but then you can say that doesn't matter because the only claims we're interested in dealing with in the system are ones whose provenance is Socrates.com, or perhaps some other structured debate site that makes is similarly as strict in trying to strip claims of all assumptions other than that someone went to a site, about with for canonical claims. And
yeah, okay,
so,
I understand you now. That's not a bad way of expressing it, except that ideally what we can agree on as a group is then to have like some source being the canonical claim database, right?
yep. Which could be, I could be a hash on IPFS, it could be a URL, it could be an ID.
Yeah.
I keep saying it can be multiple with federation. Like if you have equivalence between systems, it's fine. But what I keep saying myself is saying that the so-called decontextualized claim is decontextualized as a status versus as a relative status is an illusion, because there's always the context of, you know, a set of cultural assumptions at a point in time in history, in a place in history. There's always a provenance. And like we try to reduce it, and we do all we can to reduce it and make it clearer. And I totally agree with the goal of reducing the dependence on context. But I'm saying
there's no shared provenance. There might always be provenance, but the point is there's no shared provenance. So how do you resolve that?
What do you mean by no shared provenance?
There might be multiple provenances. The
yes.
point of the
and each of these,
debate is to go ahead.
I've always said there's two distinct entity types, and they're distinct. There's the contextualized claims and the decontextualized claims. Well, and actually, I keep saying about the decontextualized claims don't exist except as relative. But
exactly, so that's why you confuse me that you bring up that argument again.
Fair enough. But what I'm saying is you have provenance, but you're also creating an abstraction, which is all the claims sharing that expression. And that's an abstraction. So, and that's what I'm calling the decontextualized claim here.
Okay.
It's and some of them are useless. They're still ambiguous. They're not decontextualized in the sense of, and between those, there's interpretation, right? What you're doing is you start from a contextualized claim, ambiguous. You link it to an interpretation, which may or may not come from a document. You may just have
that process, for me, I don't want to mull interpretation where you do. Interpretation for me is argumentation. Like different interpretations for me in a base layer should be mulled as argumentation, where then different interpretations might agree or disagree on that. Like it's through argumentation that you uncover different interpretations, which are still decontextualized.
Right. Fair enough. No, interpretation is a claim. One second. Interpretation is a claim. A. B.
Can you just for clarity, can you give one example in claim form of interpretation?
Yes, sure. Let's start with our Paris is nice. So that's a contextual claim taken from somewhere. And then we say, okay, here because of the provenance, I'm interpreting it as Paris, France is a nice city because whatever criterion was used to say it's nice. And so I've decontextualized it relatively. This new sentence.
So that I don't call decontextualized.
I was wondering if we had different definitions.
Oh,
yeah,
that's definitions are clear.
What?
But maybe keeping the definitions open, you could continue exploring that same use case.
Agreed.
So I think Stephen doubts that there's even any utility to starting with the claim Paris is nice made somewhere in some context other than the top level.
Yeah, it's a core use case for me and Jamie. It's not a core use case for him, and that's fine. Right, we want to handle it, but it's that it's not core for him is fine.
I think it might still be useful to discuss that use case, and what might happen then is someone realized this needs to be clarified. This is ambiguous, et cetera, et cetera. Somebody goes to the canonical site and says Paris Hilton, the socialite celebrity, is a very nice (3) kind to other people person, right? And to start gaining value, to make the discussion valuable, somehow you have to make that link. Now, maybe we should explore how, against how you would make that link. Like, what would be the story? You know, what are you going to do? Someone
Yeah, I
starts.
think
with,
that's totally useful to do. Yes.
like, what does a user do at that point? Does a user, for example, is there a user interface that lets you say, I think that this claim is the same as this canonical claim, and submit that
Yes.
URL. And then you've kind of submitted the claim that this is saying that, and that's kind of what Fisket does, right? You know, so interpretation is done in that case by claiming that this you know, this tweet, this comment, this whatever, this article is making this canonical claim. But you always link to the canonical claim when you make that assertion.
Which is the one I call decontextualized, by the way, the canonical one. Canonical and decontextualized for me are equivalent.
Yeah, so I'd like to hear Stephen define, was it decontextualized claim? Because I actually thought the way Marc Antoine explained it was the way you were doing it.
Yeah, I'm really flummoxed by your
decontextualized for me.
No, in that, well, maybe in that example, what would be a decontextualized claim?
The one you link to, the canonical one.
Right. The one that's posted on a
okay, well, right.
website.
So Marc Antoine rephrased Paris is nice to Paris, the city
Paris in France.
It's nice because it's walkable, which I loved walking Paris. Why is that not the decontextualized claim that claim's linking to?
Because it contains a link to the external source, which needs to be.
Well, it's mentioned.
No, it's linked to by the external source.
Linked. It's just like, as a note, this is one of the things this came from, and it could be one of many. But we're not saying this is that. We're just saying
the original Paris is nice has
say that is his idea of the canonical claim, but in the decontextualized claim.
Paris is nice was a contextual claim, and then when I say there's an interpretation, I'm saying I'm linking that contextual claim, or even its decontextualized provenance-free abstraction, which links many provenance concrete examples. And I'm linking that to say, but no, I'll do it provenance-wise. This provenance, this contextualized claim from this provenance links to a decontextualized claim with is the rephrasing.
Now,
and this one doesn't have provenance except through the link.
In this case, we're talking about some website somewhere where people have discussions, and somewhere deep in the discussion about, you know, where should we go on vacation, you know, after a lot of context has been built among the people discussing, a lot of shared assumptions, somebody says Paris is nice.
Yeah.
And that is, according to Stephen's definition, definitely not a decontextualized claim.
Well, that depends what you're pointing to.
Well, then, so what I'm saying is that you haven't yet pointed to the claim Paris Hilton, or Paris the city, is a very nice place to visit on the canonical debate website. You're still on this other website,
yes,
deep in the conversation tree.
That's clearly contextual.
Text, and that's very contextual. That to say, you really got to know all this context to understand that what they mean by Paris is nice. And then at some point, there's a link to a claim that people that even weren't involved in that discussion can understand, that anyone that speaks English can understand, just by going to that link, that one link, and they know exactly what the idea, is that they know exactly what is being said. Of course, some people might go to that site and just put Paris is nice, right, as a canonical claim. And then at that point, of course, we need processes for saying, okay, clarifying, dating.
But it's still a decontextualized claim if somebody adds it as such on, yes.
Yeah, because there's
that's my point
in that case about what Paris is nice means.
Exactly.
Other than just general social, anyone using the internet might assume.
No, and I never disagreed with that, by the way, Stephen. I agree that when you put Paris is nice decontextualized in the system, it's an ambiguous claim, but it's a valid, as a sentence, decontextualized claim. But then when you want to say, well, what does that mean? Because it's ambiguous, you'll probably refer to.
So that's why we disagree. No, I don't want to refer to anyone.
You
that
don't want
mentioned
to,
that,
I
because
want to.
then you contextualize
Simple.
it again.
Well,
This is where the disagreement lies. The
Yeah.
nature of it being decontextualized means that you cut off the provenance, because there might be many different provenances. If it's ambiguous, so be it. It's ambiguous. Yes, I'm fully on board with making more specialized versions and clear disambiguated decontextualized claims of the same one and linking those and splitting that off. But I'm not okay with having any interaction where you start pulling in this external context again, because you're contextualizing decontextualized claims and you're pushing the discussions again to you're doing the opposite of the canonical debates.
so
No,
Steve is saying there should be a one-way link. And so in that deep discussion, you can link to the contextualized claim on the.
That's the main use case, yes. I'm not even against two-way linking, but it's not to interpret the decontextualized claim.
Yeah, but you're saying it could be a real mess. You're suggesting that all the discussion about what was meant by Paris is nice in that context, or in any context, should happen somewhere else.
Okay,
Yeah.
and the reason I still want it, by the way, is that I can see somebody doing purely at the decontextualized level. This can be interpreted as that at the decontextualized level, and someone saying, nobody will ever read this sentence at this way. That's ridiculous. You're making a perfectly, absurd reading. And then I could say, well, here it was done in this context. So that's a counter argument, and it's valid and it belongs. And that's why context matters.
But it doesn't necessarily need to be in the base layer. So if somebody says God exists, and someone can say, do you mean God is defined by Hegel, right? Or do you mean Paris as the city? And you still don't need to
it's possible to do it without keeping the context, but I'm saying it will make a lot of discussions much more difficult, because at some point you need to refer to the context. It's very simple. I'm not a real scholar, but I have enough of a scholarly bent to just have that. Don't throw away information when you can keep it. This thing came with provenance. Don't discard it. It's pretty much that simple. And knowing what interpretations are actually made for me is information. And I don't
like I said, I don't disagree with two-way linking. I disagree with requiring interpretation of the provenance to have a meaningful discussion about the decontextualized claim, because the whole exercise of decontextualizing is that that you don't need the provenance, because
if you're saying you can argue about interpretation sometimes without referring to provenance, I have no problem with that. But I'm saying you will often end up needing the provenance in real conversations. That's what I'm saying.
I also agree there. And I'm saying,
so we don't disagree that much.
No, but that's not a concern of the base layer. That's a concern of whoever is on that website, on that system, on that whatever where the provenance comes from. There you can have a discussion about whether or not it means a decentralized claim. But it's only relevant to that context, context.
What I did say is maybe the provenance link doesn't need to live in the base layer, but the notion of interpretation needs to live in the base layer. And I think the notion of this is a contextual versus a decontextualized claim, this distinction needs to exist.
But I think an interpretation is by nature contextualized. For me, interpretation and contextualized claims are actually synonymous.
And they're not synonymous, but if you're saying
an interpretation for me is like you said it before, author source says text, which means the contextualized claim. That is for me an interpretation or a contextualized claim.
But okay, this is obviously true, but it also applies to disambiguating an ambiguous decontextualized claim. I'm extending the definition to that case.
Come again, the last part?
I'm saying it also extends to distinguishing different versions of an ambiguous decontextualized claim.
How is that true? How would that work? So you have a decontextualized claim, God is real.
Guys, I probably better go.
Yeah, actually in 20 minutes I'll sort that out.
Okay.
Can you, just as a closing remark, might want to write out an example maybe and write it in Slack? Because
Well,
that's the thing I don't get.
Well, I mean, I'll take the same. Paris is nice. Why bother going more complicated? Paris is nice. You said yourself can
Jonathan.
exist.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Can exist as a decontextualized claim. And then I can say, well, there's multiple interpretations of that sentence, also decontextualized, but more decontextualized, which is Paris, the capital of France, Paris, the city in Texas, Paris, Hilton, Paris, Greek hero. Those are interpretations of the ambiguous decontextualized sentence. You can play that game. And I'm saying it's the same game. Saying there's multiple interpretations of that ambiguous statement, it's true whether you're speaking about a contextual or decontextualized claim. It's the same notion of interpretation. It's true that if you have context, you have better ground to argue that certain interpretations do or don't apply to a contextual claim, which is a separate conversation. But the operation of saying this ambiguous statement has multiple less ambiguous interpretations, that's independent of whether
the
you're
interpretation
talking...
requires context.
No, not by my definition of interpretation. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying linking the ambiguous statement to less ambiguous versions of the same statement is what I call interpretation.
But you wouldn't link. But you wouldn't link to a source, and or the source you would link to be what would be the decontextualized claim.
I would do either. Sometimes I'll do it.
But so you're saying it's the same process, and that's what I was trying to understand. So by that you mean that you have one interpretation people can add where they link to the decontextualized claim, which I interpret as Paris, the city in France. And then another could be you link to a website where Paris is nice is mentioned, and you link it to a decontextualized claim, Paris is person.
Yes.
Okay, I got you now. I mean, I don't know whether that's something I want, but I understand what you meant by that last point.
Good progress.
Yeah, and more than what you want, but we're discussing would you allow in that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because I think I want it either way, but yeah, it's more like where does it live in? Okay, no, thanks, perfect. That explained it.
Good.
Let's call it a meeting then.
Yeah, exhausted.
See you next time.
See you next time.
Hope you feel better soon.
Thanks. Bye.